started. Thank you all for coming, and today we're honored to have Tony Fuller, our colleague from Speech Communication, and Tony's title today is Freedom of Speech, Responsibilities, Limitations, and Absolutes. Thank you, Tony.
Well, first, it is my pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. And to speak on this topic is especially interesting to me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. First, before we get started on talking about freedom of speech and the First Amendment, I would like to just go back a little and put a context on when this was written, just as our nation was being formed, because really the marketplace of ideas, that cauldron, is what fermented and allowed us to come up with a system that we have. And the marketplace of ideas has to do really with exchange of ideas and a free exchange of ideas, and that's the best order, okay? And that's what gave birth to the idea of the First Amendment. So what about the Bill of Rights? The First Amendment is the first of the 10 articles or amendments to our Constitution. And when you think about what is the Bill of Rights to do? Well, as you may know, we have the oldest and the shortest Constitution in the world. How many knew that? The oldest and the shortest Constitution in the world, and it is beautifully written, obviously. And the founders took great care to shape that instrument. But one of the things to understand is the dimension of, I think disharmony might be a good word to describe our founding fathers, because there was not a harmonious, we're on the same page and let's just go. There were many factions of disagreement across the board about what the nation would be, whether there should be a nation, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the cauldron I'm talking about, of the marketplace of ideas, because many people were putting up different ideas. And yet somehow that disparate conceptual group was able to formulate something as beautiful and as artistic and complete as the Constitution. Now, when I say complete, I mean as an ideal. Ultimately, in fairly short order, of course, everyone started looking at it and said, this is great, but, I'm feeling a little exposed here. How do I know this won't happen to me in terms of my personal rights? And so, subsequent to the writing of the Constitution, then this notion of the Bill of Rights came up. We're going to amend the Constitution. There was actually an argument as to whether we should include those within the Constitution or make them amendments and have them standalone parts of the Constitution. Because the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution, but it's an external part, it wasn't put within. And there were several drafts of these amendments, and ultimately 2 of the amendments that Madison wrote, he proposed number 1 and number 14, were combined and they became the First Amendment. My own thought, and I think many academics that have studied this think that the placement of the First Amendment was intentional, stating that it is the preeminent, most important, not that the others are not important, but is the preeminent. It is what allows us to obtain what we need to in terms of this marketplace of ideas. And so, in fact, let's just read. Let's have some more fancy video here. The First Amendment. And pardon me, I'm going to read it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. This has a tremendous amount of depth in it. And many entire courses are taught just on how to think and interpret this. And so we're going to give it a stab, but understand there are essentially three major elements here. And the first is, of course, having to do with religion, and what are our rights about religion. And the second would be speech, and speech comes in many forms. Most of us think of speech as being a person that is saying something, but speech comes in many other forms also beyond the verbal. And then finally, action. And those are the three elemental areas addressed in the First Amendment. So remember, these are about guarantees, personal right guarantees that our founding fathers wanted to make certain that were not ignored and could not be abridged. Well, let's just look first broadly. What is the First Amendment designed to do? Is to protect citizens from encroachment or impediment by the government. That's the first item to recognize about the First Amendment, is really protecting the citizen from the government. Because in retrospect, when you study that time period, you see that the British had, the English had a system set up, and much of which we ended up using in our own law, common law, parliamentarian rules of order. But what was not in, and what was added here, were not private rights that were extolled there. They weren't. And if you were, before we became a nation, if you lived here, you were, if you were a citizen over there and you lived here, you were still seen as a secondary citizen. You had secondary rights, and you weren't seen as a citizen. And so your rights were even diminished over what the English citizens would have been. So it's really important to understand that when we're talking about that, the idea is that it's not going to be, the government is not going to be able to suppress or restrict from communicating ideas on religion, politics, political speech, social, personal. Also, it addresses whether that's in person. It also addresses mediated forms of communication, the same arena, the same elements, and meaning the press at that time. Now it would be expanded to the other media, mass media that we have. And of course, into action. And an action can be something such as a rally. It could be a protest, and there are clearly different outcomes and different elements. So what about the various dimensions of religion, speech, and action? Well, of course, the English historically married religion and the state, and we wanted to make sure, the founding fathers wanted to make sure that that did not occur here. And so that's why it is saying, expressly says, no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. You can have any religion or none at all. Speech, abridging freedom of speech. When we look at some of the laws that were passed and enforced by our own government later, you'll see that sometimes at that point we didn't have freedom of speech, not nearly like we would think of it today. And in action, having a rally or a protest, you could get in big trouble. One of the areas to think about the First Amendment has to do with how are we going to interpret it. Are we going to interpret it from a literal sense or a subjective a more subjective, situational perspective. Because for the most part, I think the First Amendment and the Constitution was intended to be interpreted literally. However, the language is so non-specific that leaves it open to morphing in a good sense, because society changes and traditions and how we interact changes. Now, when you're thinking about situational or subjective application, what are some of do you suppose that anyone that might really agree with this whole notion of freedom of speech, right? I can say anything I want. Well, what about art? What if, we are known as a parochial or society, right? And we are known for being prudish. So what if someone in good standing says, I think that art is too ribald, it's too suggestive. What about that? Can we put some restrictions on that? Should we be able to? It seems like it's for the greater good, right? What about, isn't it our duty to restrict unpopular political speech? What about the KKK? Shouldn't we not allow that? Well, these are big questions. And what about behavior? What if someone burns their draft card? Isn't that disrespectful to America? Or even yet burns the American flag? Well, those are all very interesting questions. And for the most part, up until the early 1900s, the First Amendment did not have a lot of interpretation. It was just seen as an absolute. And over the years, it began to take a more focused, concentrated shape as the courts became involved, and especially the Supreme Court decisions. One of the first was in 1918, and which in a Scheck versus the U.S., and it has to do with protesting conscription for World War I. And this fellow named Scheck and his wife, who were well-to-do in New York, decided, hey, we are going to send out our little flyers and saying that this is really bad. The nation should not have conscription. Right? That's communication. That's freedom of speech. And yet, they were convicted. And they were convicted on this premise. And Holmes, the Supreme Court, one of the Supreme Court justices, and a very famous one, wrote the unanimous decision, and that they upheld the conviction, and also developed the very famous phrase, clear and present danger, because that was the first real look at how should we think about freedom of speech. Can I just say anything I want to, Martina? Can I just say anything? Are there no consequences? Well, this was a comparison, not saying that Schleck, in this case, specifically was doing this, but he said it'd be the equivalent of going to a crowded theater and yelling, fire, 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 because you're creating a clear and present danger for the safety of others. And then what you have is a balancing act between the right of freedom of speech with the right of personal safety. And that was a big step towards qualification of the First Amendment, and specifically for freedom of speech. And there have been a whole host of findings across a whole host of different dimensions as the definition and shaping of what the First Amendment means over the years. So, more visuals. All right. Now, absolutes. Are there any absolutes to freedom of speech, the portion of the First Amendment? Well, let's look at what I think are absolutes. Number one, I believe that there's an absolute guarantee of a continuing flow and exchange of ideas, whether the ideas are harmonious or not, whether they're disharmonious, discordant. Contrarian. What's another assumption? I think that's a very fair assessment of what one of the assumptions of freedom of speech is. Another one would be the symbiotic relationship between democracy and free speech. The symbiotic relationship between those two is imperative. It's built into the notion of democracy. I have a voice. I have an individual voice. Of course, we're a republic, but we're a democracy. One of the assumptions of that relationship is that the assumption of an informed citizen for a successful democracy. We must have an informed citizenry for democracy. Yes. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of irony in there. Yes, there is. Critical thinking and all. And then, of course, also the assumption of a free exchange of ideas to promote an informed citizenry. Who is going to determine what is an informed citizenry? Is it going to be us? Is it going to be some third party that will say, okay, you now have proper information, you can go forth and prosper? Okay. So I think those are the absolutes, and I'm certain there are more, but that's how I think about the absolutes. Let's look at the limitations of, okay, and there are a number of them. First, let's talk about sedition and wartime laws, because mostly we don't think about it too much, but guess what? When we go to war, the rules of engagement for freedom of speech changes. Should it? Probably. And there are arguments back and forth about that, but let's talk about some of the most major of the restrictions. And they happen to be the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798, of 1918, the Smith Act of 1940, and then HUAC, Committee on Un-American Activities, House Committee. Okay, so what about, do you suppose there were many restrictions going on in 1798? What's that all about? Sedition, that's when someone's treasonous, right? They came over and tried to steal our secrets. Well, we were having a dispute with France at the time, and there was some talk about, yes, that's why we need these laws, but actually there was the counter-argument that it had to do with the presidential election, because John Adams was the president, and guess who was running against him? The next president was Thomas Jefferson. And guess who got thrown in jail if they wrote an editorial or they published a newspaper that was criticizing, because that was seen as an act of sedition according to this law, these laws. There were several. If you criticize the powers to be, meaning John Adams, about 20 different editors were thrown in jail. Interesting, huh? Just out of a show of hands, did everyone already know that?
I didn't know the 20, but I know.
Okay. And what was interesting is this law was set up as a sunset law, meaning that it would end immediately if the current president didn't like it, it would sunset, and if the current president remained the same, he would expand it, presumably. And Thomas Jefferson won the election, and on January 1, and in that era, January 1 was the inauguration, not January 20th, the laws sunsetted and all of the editors were released. And that was suppression of communication by the government. Next, the Espionage Act of 1918. There were several. And this had to do, essentially, there were a series of acts, but the most stringent one, that 1918, had to do with you couldn't criticize the war, essentially. And if you did, you could be convicted of Espionage Act. And there were some 900 people, 2,000 trials, or 2,000 charged, 900 people were convicted of violating this. One of those was Eugene V. Debs. I'm sure most of you are familiar with him. And wow, he actually stayed in for a while. They didn't let him out right away. Another type of government impingement was the Smith Act in 1940. And this was a little bit different. What this said is that in order, if you're in the news arena, you've got to go through a board of censorship. You have to go through, and for the most part, Army personnel censors if you're writing an article, and that's what the Smith Act was. That was 1940, actually before we went to war. And then HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And this committee was chaired, I'm sure almost all of you know, are well familiar with McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, and starting in the late 40s up through the early 50s, he commanded a lot of attention and was reelected based on this premise of the Red Scare. And there was an ongoing permanent committee, House committee, that was investigating this, and he was the chair of it. And so these are 4 instances that the government went during wartime, and that was the Red Scare, that was the Cold War, if you will, and it was seen as appropriate. I think it's an interesting question whether the rules should change or not, but it seems prudent that the rules should change, but how much? Okay. Then about prior restraint. These are different types of limitations. Prior restraint is if someone doesn't like what someone's getting ready to publish, they can go to court and ask to have it prohibited from publication, right? Or a presentation of some type. This is extremely difficult to win if you take and you go for prior restraint of some information. The classic example is the Pentagon Papers, 1971. All of you familiar with that? The Pentagon Papers were printed in the New York Times, a first day print. I've forgotten which one it was, but their whole series, there's a tremendous amount of information. And the New York Times published it, and immediately a court injunction was slapped on them, which prohibited them from publishing for 2 weeks. And they had an abbreviated trial, and it was found that you, in this case, you cannot censor this, and you can punish after the fact, but not before the fact, is the basic premise of prior restraint. Censorship has to do with many different areas, but the most obvious would be obscenity. What do we deem as obscene? And a finding in 1973 from Miller v. California developed what's known as the lapse test. Literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And actually there were 3 components beyond the 3 total components, and you had to have, in order to pass the lapse test, was actually quite a high standard. And so it had to have, well, I don't want to go into the details of that, but you had to have, basically, the community had to be opposed, and it had to show very specific type of excrement or some type of bodily activity like that. And then it had to go through lapse test, and all 3 of those components had to be checked off in order for something to be censored, and that was in 73. But before then, censorship, and it still abounds to some extent. Libel, what is libel? You have libel, which is generally written or something in a mediated format, or you have slander spoken. And the basic idea is, of course, if you say something that harms me, I can then sue you because you've harmed me. Well, and by the way, the British, wow, you better really watch what you say if you go to Britain, because you can get sued much easier. Does this ring a bell?
I know some people have been excluded from the United Kingdom.
For, yes.
Thrown out, and they can't go there.
Okay, and the rules are much more stringent there. But our test of, it's really interesting how our test of what is libelous came about. It actually came about some 50 years before we became a country. And I'm certain that some of you are familiar with this, but in 1733, 34, and 35, a fellow named John Peter Zinger, who was a newspaper publisher, did what? He was publishing some non-complimentary articles about the governor. And the governor said, no, you're not going to do it. And so he published in 33, he was charged in 34, and went to trial in 35. And by the way, his wife, Anna, was off publishing on her own while he was in the clink. Which is a nice little twist, I think. But this is a really important case, because this case established the truth is always a defense against libel. This is a really big deal. The truth is always a defense against libel. In other words, if you say something that harms me, as long as it's true, hey, you can't win in a libelous suit because it's true. On the face of it, we accept it. It's such an obvious part of America that we don't even question it. But at that time, it was a really big deal for that to be established as a precept. Okay, John Peter Zinger, one of my heroes, and Anna too. Okay, privacy has to do with how we are treated differently if we're a public or a private figure. And the rules are essentially different. If I'm a private citizen, I have more rights of privacy than if I'm a public figure. The expectation is different. If I'm a public speaker, a public figure, a politician or a celebrity, it is a given that I will not have the same level of privacy as a normal individual. And so the rules are a little different across the board. Are there any categorical limitations? Well, some of them are obvious. We've already spoken about obscenities, such as child porn. What about a true threat to someone? Can you threaten someone's life? Absolutely not. What about fighting words? Fighting words are another category that you cannot use. That is prohibited speech. Incitement to imminent lawless action. Hey, let's go rob a bank.
Yeah,
Let's get one that has some money in it too.
where else?
Yeah, let's go to the cash vault downtown. Okay. And then criminal solicitation or defamation. So these are categories. And what we have listed here have lots and lots of court cases that have been looked at over the years. Okay, and then when we finally, so we've looked at absolutes, we've looked at limitations. What about responsibilities? Are there responsibilities in how we communicate and what we communicate? Can we communicate any thought without considering the outcome? Okay. And if so, would that include intentionally provoking someone to respond violently? What about Charlie Hebdo? And what happened there very recently, what is that, 3 or 4 weeks now? Now it's, I guess, 4 or 5 weeks? Okay. And this was a satirical French cartoon magazine, weekly magazine, that has published lots, apparently I'm not that familiar with the magazine, but published lots of heretical and very disrespectful images across all the different religions, across just about any domain that you can think of, and they were hit by Islamic terrorists whenever that was, 5 or 6 weeks ago, as retribution for their editorial content. And so were they trying, you know, the person that was killed, I think the publisher, he had a bodyguard. He knew he was under scrutiny and had been under scrutiny. So what are the ground rules there? What about, is provocative material okay when making a social or political point? And one of the most scintillating or ones over the years was Jerry Falwell versus Larry Flynt, 1988. And I don't know if you've ever been around any of the players. I was around Falwell a little. I directed a couple of programs for him. They had, whenever their equipment broke, they'd come to our station, and I directed a couple of programs, and he was quite the person around town. Flynt, I've never met, but anyway, so in Hustler, which was a very controversial magazine because it showed women in complete nudity, and sometimes in, some would argue, in not a very nice way, he published this. And Flynt, if you follow his story, is a very iconoclastic and a very unusual character, and he published this, and it was a takeoff on an ad that Campari had been doing, and he just filled in Jerry Falwell, and he just put it in his magazine. And it's highly satirical, and it's saying that the first time he lost his virginity was with his own mother in an outhouse. And this was a battle in the courts for quite a while. And Flynt eventually ended up winning because the reasoning was that no one would ever think that he was seriously defamed, because everyone would understand that the exaggeration of this was so much that it could not be true. And that was, and so it was seen as political satire and not as something to defame this, you know, very famous moral majority person. So, anyway, Larry Flynt has always gone right to the edge. And when we're thinking about responsibilities, yesterday I just received one of the journals that I receive in mass media and education, and it was talking about this very question. It's a delicate balance of rights and responsibilities when we're talking about what are our responsibilities in what we communicate to others. It's a very delicate balance. So, all right. Are we having fun yet? When's the fun start? All right. Ooh, American flag, freedom of speech. Let's talk about freedom of speech in an academic setting. You know, what are the ground rules? What are the expectations of freedom of speech in an academic setting? Well, by definition, an academic environment is charged with procuring, developing, and advancing human and individual knowledge. Just by definition. That's what a university or a college is supposed to do. We're supposed to do that. Freedom of speech is a predicate to maturation of these ideas, of the goals of a university or a college. You cannot come to maturation of these ideas without having full freedom of speech. because it inhibits this marketplace of ideas, discussion. Why don't we just talk about 80% of the ideas out there? Let's not talk about the other 20%, especially that which is inconvenient to speak about. Let's just not speak about that. And that can be very debilitating to a bigger picture. Obstructionism of the marketplace of ideas in the name of either expediency or political populism or economic efficiencies are not sufficient reasons to allow impediment of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is one of the most inherent, and I argue the primary amendment to our Constitution. It is a right. And historically, colleges and universities have promoted the notion of a free and open exchange of ideas. That's an obligation, historically, of colleges and universities. V.O. Key, who is a long deceased, fairly famous political theoretician and just all-around dynamic person, says that the clash of ideas is what produces the best part of democracy. The clash of ideas produces the best part of democracy and allows us to really allow the necessary ideas to be shaken out, to emerge from this clash. He says it's the highest order of democracy and the best part of democracy. What is a university or college's obligation to promote freedom of the press? It's a very interesting question. Historically, universities and colleges have very clearly supported this notion of student publication. And it has to do with a microcosm of what we've just been speaking about in the broader context of the marketplace of ideas and freedom of speech given by the First Amendment to the Constitution. There have been many colleges and universities over the last 8 or 10 years have retreated from the benefits of academic freedom by utilizing a more corporate approach to communication. This isn't any single campus that's doing this. This was a model that's emerged, and it really restricts all of the better parts of freedom of speech. And it is utilizing more of an economic model. And now, when we're talking about freedom of speech, that's why I want everyone to really truly understand this is from freedom of speech from impediment by the government. What about if you work for a corporation? Do you have a right, do you have the same rights if you work, freedom of speech, if you work for a corporation? And the short answer is no, you don't. If you work for a corporation, you have some rights, but you do not have unfettered rights. And certainly you cannot go into a corporation, and you can say something, but you're going to pay the price for having said whatever it is, depending on the severity and the cogency of the whatever you said, or appropriateness or inappropriateness. And so it'll be very interesting to see how this emerges in a broader sense, because one of the things that I've noticed in life is that most of the big items in life are on a pendulum of some type. Sometimes the pendulum is 3 to 5 years, sometimes it's over 20 or 30 years. But there is a pendulum that swings back and forth on virtually every big item that you can think of. And so communication patterns in the workplace are certainly one of those. And I have a little bit more, but I think I'd really like to open it up to Q&A or comments from you, because I'd like to hear what some of your thoughts are. But that's essentially my presentation on freedom of speech.
I've always been intrigued by these alien and sedition laws that the first generation of the founders could have crafted a First Amendment about, in its language, pretty libertarian view of a free speech, and then could have passed certain laws that sure seem to me to be most antithetical to the spirit and the language of the First Amendment. But I do think it underscores several things. That first of all, no right is absolute. It may be stated in absolutistic type language, but in practice it cannot be carried out absolutely. Secondly, the rights language in the Constitution is often, as you point out, not unambiguous. In fact, deliberately left open-ended so as to be worked out. I think Jefferson has a quotation on this, by future generations in particular contexts. And Adams was a Federalist. He was from Massachusetts. He had a very different view, not only about free speech, but about religion than a Jefferson did from Virginia, who was much more libertarian regarding both free speech and free exercise of religion. Because I've seen some connections between religious liberty issues and free speech issues, it just underscores to me the difficulty of something I hear quite often, of talking about an original intent to sections of the Constitution. Because you had different understandings of even the same language between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. You had a different understanding between Hamilton and Jefferson regarding the nature of the Constitution itself. You had a different understanding between an Adams and a Jefferson with regards to both religious liberty and free speech. But when I first read of the alien sedition laws, I could not believe what I was reading. But I have more libertarian, Jeffersonian understanding of those. I just could not believe it.
Well, it's very interesting that you pointed that out, because the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. It was written in 1789. And there was a lot of parsing of words, because there were a number of different generations. I think there were 3 major iterations of this, because you had to get agreement. You wanted agreement. You not only had to pass it from the Founding Fathers, but you had to then go have the states ratify it. Because if a state didn't ratify it, then it was no good. I think 10 of the 13 states had to ratify it. And so it's very interesting. In some respects, some of the language of the Constitution and the amendments, I think, is written intentionally, not vaguely, but with growing room or growing purpose. But on the other hand, some of it, I think, had to do with, we've just got to get this done. This person thinks this, anti-federalist versus federalist, and this person thinks this. What can we agree on? And that's why I'm talking about this cauldron of, because there was a lot of disagreement. Anyway, thank you for sharing that. I think it's, yeah.
You mentioned that in times of war, these things sort of change a little bit. It reminded me of what former Chief Justice Rehnquist said. He said, when we're at war, the Constitution isn't silent, it just speaks with a softer voice.
I like that phrase, yeah.
And we had this committee when I was at the DA's office about sin. So you got pornography, right? Well, pornography is anything that's naked pictures, movies, videos, but that's not necessarily illegal. But if it's obscene, then it's illegal. And how they decided whether it was obscene, in the famous words, Justice, I think it was Stevens, was, I know it when I see it.
Right.
Right. So, and so we had this committee because it was based on the prevailing standards of the community. And so there was a committee, and these guys, good work if you could get on this committee, right? It's better than the committees we sit on. It was, they watched these porn videos at their lunch hour. And, well, I always wanted to get on that committee, and not why you think. No, because I thought it was outrageous. Because I take a Jeffersonian Witten view of free speech. And I hope your flyer that I put you in the Jefferson.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Jeff Soda, Madisonian, yes.
And these guys, they would come back from these, and they never put me on the committee. And they'd come back from lunch and they would decide that basically that videos that were obscene were things they didn't like. So if it was heterosexual sex, that was fine. If it was homosexual sex, that was obscene. And they had certain standards, like animals, that's obscene. Children, that's obscene. But one time they came back from lunch and it was heterosexual sex, but it was some kind of video where the people being filmed they weighed like 350 pounds each. Okay, and these guys are just so appalled at this. That's just obscene. I'm like, how is that obscene? Because they don't fit your definition of beauty, but you know, they never put me on the committee.
Well, I guess they didn't buy too many fetish videos. Jeff, you had something to.
Well, I was wondering if government spying on the citizens suppresses free speech. NSA and the CIA have extensive amounts of spying, and according to Edward Snowden, it's not just metadata that is kept, but because they're contracting these out to corporations instead of doing it themselves, they're collecting all data, all electronic data. I wonder if that has a suppressing effect on free speech.
Well, I don't think there's any question that it does, because privacy, that just directly goes to the issue of privacy. We have inherent rights of privacy. Now, privacy is not listed in the First Amendment, but it has evolved as an element of acceptance that we have a right to privacy from, I think it comes under the assemblage. In other words, how we meet, who we meet with, etc. And so there's no question. Actually, what you're saying is very interesting, because I'm about halfway through the book of the history of the CIA. It's not a pretty picture, but, and this is from documents that have been over the years opened up some 50 years later. Well, I mean, it goes back to the famous legal phrase, the chilling effect. It has a chilling effect, of course it does, because it's going to inhibit people from willingly, openly discussing whatever they wish to discuss. As long as it doesn't fall into one of the categories that is a no-no, such as obscenity as it's defined, fighting words, incitement to violence, criminal activity, that's, and kind of interestingly enough, sometimes the administration that's in power, not speaking of any specific administration, but an administration that's in power historically might be for states' rights and not federal rights, but when it comes to gathering that type of information, all kinds of administrations have, I don't want to say blundered into it, but have utilized overseeing and obtaining information from private individuals. And clearly they're related.
Isn't it kind of time that we come to grips with the fact that privacy is an illusion? I mean, this isn't, we're not writing parchment. Things don't go away. They know where your cell phone is, that means you're there. I can find that out, and I don't have any particular need for it. So are you really private, or you just want that warm fuzzy? Who is private?
Well, I would counter by saying, does that mean that we should just absolve any agency of the responsibilities of
No, but
observing our...
you can't make the argument that we're private, that our privacy is being taken away when it's been an illusion for about 48 years.
Oh, I'm not sure I agree with the premise, because what level of privacy are we speaking about? I mean, the assumption, if I just, and I may not be hearing what you're saying properly, but is that we have some all-knowing, all-seeing elements over here and they know everything about me. Well, the fact is they don't. Now, there were some people like Martin Luther King who clearly had the FBI spying, and they probably did pretty much know everything about him. But as far as individual citizens, we're not there. Every time we have a new technology that emerges, we have to address these same issues, because there aren't laws on the books about whatever it is.
When
Laws are-
credit cards became part of the thing that we do as humans, a lot of that privacy went away. And it wasn't the federal government, it was the company, the bank, the clearinghouse, the funding company, the financial services company. They've had that information since credit cards.
Well, they do have.
We just
the
don't have laws that are
They-
representative of the technology that is represented.
Well,
And so it's an
unfortunately,
illusion.
well, unfortunately, I think that we sign our rights away
Yes.
every time we get on Facebook. We sign up for that account. And I think that in this pendulum will ultimately swing back to some extent. We can't go and hide our head in the sand like an ostrich, but no, I'm not ready to give up the
So
notion.
no one's upset that Target had 3.8 million data breaches for its customers 4 times in 1 year.
I think people are upset about that. Just because people are infringing on our rights doesn't mean we don't have those rights.
Right.
And I agree with you, that
Well, we-
technology is, to a certain extent, with increased security, typically you lose some of your freedom. So how much of that freedom are we signing away, like you state, and how much of it is just people taking advantage of technology, and we don't have any laws on the books?
We do have laws, but they're not Americans.
Yeah, we still have the right, someone can't stick a camera, shouldn't be sticking cameras in our house and observing what we're doing. That doesn't mean that someone won't do it at some time. And like you said, they can track you now with your cell phone just about wherever you go. But most people are not aware of that, I don't think.
Right, so in that case, that's the illusion part, right?
Yeah,
That's the case.
it is, but we still, even though.
Let's be comfortable.
If we give it up, you're basically like Professor Fuller saying you're stating because it's an illusion, we should give up on.
No, I'm
what's
not
up
making
there.
that assumption at all. I'm just saying it's an illusion.
Well, I
And I
would,
agree with you that for law to keep up with technology and digital media, it is a really difficult thing. But yeah, of course, as a civilized society, we want to establish laws to protect certain rights. And I'm always First Amendment free speech as a communication professor. But I agree with privacy limitations. I mean, if I took Dr. Fuller's class and I felt like he embarrassed me, and I wanted to get back on him, and I went to rateyourprofessor.com, and I decided not only do I want to write something, but I might use that new drone I just got, and with the camera, maybe go over April Sound, and oh wow, he's out on his boat, and he likes to sunbathe nude, and I'm going to take some pictures, and I'm going to post those on rateyourprofessor.com. Whatever happens. But he should have that, right of, wow, an extreme infringement of privacy, nudity, pictures, I'm a professional, this is unacceptable, I sue you.
And the irony is that those laws don't exist.
well, actually, if.
Well,
And they're still being
I
argued.
bet
I think
yeah,
technology
different,
is
because I have some
available.
friends who
That's the kind of the
are,
argument I'm giving.
Well, the technology is just always ahead of
Always.
the courts, right? The
Right.
technology
And now it's
is
exponential.
ahead. But the courts have recently, a 9-0 decision, so unanimous decision, a couple months ago, are finally catching up. And they said, with cell phones or laptops or computers, let's say the police pull you over,
Right.
they arrest you, and they grab this. And they used to just download it and say, oh, who are you talking to? Who's your drug dealer connections?
Yep.
And now they say you need a warrant
Yeah.
to look into any cell phones or computers. And a 9-0 decision. So I think, they're just they're behind technology,
Right.
but.
Well,
and
it
there
always-
are a
you
lot more
can't-
laws on the books in California
You-
regarding,
you-
because of public.
Because
opinion in
of
Hollywood.
Silicon Valley knows
Yeah,
what's
and
going
that
on.
too, yeah.
I'm going to come to you next, just,
Yeah.
if there are, you can't make laws before the trouble emerges. it's just like you're talking about privacy and talking about cell phones. What is the law that was passed? I'm not sure whether it was a state law, but there are several laws having to do with these idiots that are 16 or 18 are taking cameras to the mall and then holding it low and taking pictures of women that they shouldn't have. And so they made laws in response to the activity. And it by definition, by practicality, laws have to follow a negative outcome, because that's what laws are designed to do, is to regulate society's behavior. Yes, sir.
What about the obligation to say something?
Such as,
Like you have an obligation to say something. Let's say you catch wind of an Al-Qaeda plot, and you have the right to remain silent. You got to blow the whistle on some corporations, but you want to be able. I mean,
To live.
you know, if you have some information that would save the nation, or rescue somebody, or prevent some harm, you know, the freedom of speech, I just can't. It's the right to remain silent. You got to say something.
well, the right to remain silent, I defer to an attorney, but is basically for people that are charged with a crime.
Yeah, but let's say you have some positive effect that you could, or something you can actually hinder a negative in society.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because when you're thinking about what happens with a person, what is our obligation? Are we commanded to tell? No, we're not commanded to tell something that could provide a lead to do this or that. There are some exceptions, but then that also, that whole notion could lead to a very slippery slope.
Yeah, because, you know, if you say, I need to say something, and you think it would do good, but actually causes all, you know, Enron to fail or something like that. You know?
Now you tell me.
Well, look, see, that to me, actually, we did a panel on Enron about 12 years ago, and it had to do with when Enron imploded. And it was a mass hypnosis in a way, because everyone was so interested in continuing to make more money, and those that I think saw what you're saying, there were only a few people that were whistleblowers. Right now, whistleblowers are the people that typically, well, I don't know if typical, but frequently they're punished.
Lose their job.
Yeah.
And that is a really a major disincentive to just let things be.
I think too, that's cultural. We always talk about doing the right thing, but typically we look down on someone, we call someone a rat, you know, or something like that. And you should do the right thing, but culturally, you're punished for it, I think. Because even in a corporation, you know, I don't know if you want to make the analogy, but in prison you have rats, and in corporations it's that same mentality. With the police department, there's the same mentality. Cops usually don't.
The blue wall,
Yeah.
and so do other occupations, physicians, and absolutely, I think that's exactly right. In some respects, it's human nature. It's behavior, because you have a group, whatever the group is, small, large, it doesn't matter. And there's a behavioral context and the rules of behavior, not just what we should do, not just prescriptively what we should do, but what do we do? And if we stay internal, it's safer, it's warmer, and it's hard to break out, I think. I'm not sure I addressed either one of what.
Well, let's keep in mind the distinction between the ethical and the legal. I may have an ethical obligation to speak out. That will not necessarily be a legal requirement. There is an overlap between the ethical, the legal, the unethical, the illegal. I think there's a heck of a lot of things that would be very good for people to do, they ought to do from an ethical perspective, that I don't necessarily want to legislate. But it sounds almost like there's some places that have Good Samaritan laws now where you have to render aid unless it would be some kind of big threat or whatever. Maybe you could have something like a Good Samaritan law with regards to truth telling, but I would be very,
I'd like to see the enforcement of that.
very suspicious of something. I'd be very suspicious of something like that.
And I think why we're suspicious of it is,
That's closer,
if
really.
we had a positive duty to report, Al-Qaeda, then all of a sudden my neighbors from Iran, all of a sudden I'm, reporting them, and, and we saw this, or my wife from Iran. But no, we saw this, right, in Nazi Germany, that people turning in the Jews are not, the SS didn't have to go far. There was a law, you had to report your neighbors who were Jews, and then we all turned on each other, and so we don't want that.
And don't forget how close we came in the late 40s and early 50s with McCarthyism,
Oh.
because that's the same, it's the same principle. It's a collective.
Isn't that how honor codes work, however?
Yes.
For example, with Rice, the honor, if you observe cheating, there's an obligation to report, obligation to the truth and to the community and to the university.
Is that
That's
part of the
typical.
honor code of the school I went to, yeah.
What happens when you're, that's the school honor code, but what happens when your peers, if you actually do that? I mean,
Well,
Yeah.
you don't have to know who your accuser is at any of these schools either. Some of them you do need to, you eventually learn if it's gone through the process, but in many schools you don't even need to know who said it, so it could be.
This is the
something
case in
completely
rape, this is the case in sexual discrimination all the time.
No, the honor code is more about cheating.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, the not having to know who your accuser is in the military has allowed it to go on forever.
Is the Espionage Act the only one of those three that is still in effect? Or is the Smith Act still in effect too?
Oh, no, they're not in effect any longer.
The Espionage Act is.
Not that one.
Not that one? Someone was just recently convicted on the Espionage Act, 1918.
Really? Well, I'll have to go look it up. I wasn't.
Is that what habeas corpus is when somebody says something, accuse you, you have a right to meet him face to face or her? Is that what habeas corpus is?
No.
But there is a Sixth Amendment right to confront your accuser. And so in the United States, in a criminal trial, or any trial, you have the right to confront your accuser. But you don't have that right at Exxon or Lone Star or Rice University. You should.
Or the military.
But sometimes, people don't follow those rules once they get in charge.
I have a question. You mentioned earlier in your talk, used the phrase the increasing corporatization of the university, or the increasing corporatization of education, shall we say, in the United States. What other signs of that do you see in higher education, which perhaps has a chilling effect on free speech? For example, the use of the designation customers for students, the idea that that a syllabus is an implied contract. Are there others? And would you agree that that is a problem for free speech, or is it not? If we're leading people to expect certain things, which we're purveyors of a commodity rather than ideas.
Well, that's a bit of a spectrum. The spectrum is an efficiency spectrum, because that whole issue of student as customer and the more recent Texas Coordinating Board and the laws that allow you to only drop 4 classes before you are penalized, that is a business model. And I think that it clearly would discourage freedom of speech and articulation, because it's not emphasizing. One of the elements of a democracy is you have to stay focused. A successful democracy is you have to stay focused on allowing it to prosper. You have to provide an environment where speech is welcome, and if it's not, it devolves. And I think that applies in the educational arena also. When you use the business model, which de-emphasizes, by the way, I didn't mention that the business model is, the current business model is much more top-down, which means it clearly restricts the flow of information, because it's saying, here is a communication and we're sending it down. It doesn't have much of an up, and the up may have such a convoluted and scaled down way to get back up, that it is really skewed information coming up.
I suppose we should distinguish the business model from the capitalism model, in the sense of, this doesn't sound like Adam Smith, but it sounds like what's happened to Adam Smith over the centuries with the growth of the corporation.
Well, and I didn't get into corporate speech, but corporate speech is a whole nother bailiwick. And what can how can you have a corporation be an individual? I understand it intellectually, but you give it the rights of an individual and you take away the rights of the individuals of the corporation to be individuals, the rights of privacy out, and yet you give other rights to a corporation. And it's a fascinating arena.
Like being in a family with dad says, there's no cussing going on.
Do you,
There's a venue that has certain parameters around speech. And whatever it is, it could be a college that says there's no discussing da-da-da on campus. I mean, they can do that, right?
And one of the proliferations of a reduction of freedom of speech has been the designation of free speech zones. Traditionally, universities, the entire campus is a zone for freedom of speech. And why do we need a little zone? Is it
Well, I entered the free speech zone and I kind of got,
You didn't have anything to say?
No, I didn't really want to say, I felt like it was gonna come on me.
Well, they were
Maybe there's
recording
some-
you.
Maybe there's some special electromagnetic waves that are being aimed from somewhere in just that zone to kind of, and, I'm sorry, Natasha, you got?
No, but I think there's something to do with the university system it really connects maybe to an issue of tenure, and I always kind of laugh at the idea that a professor would need that job stability or tenure to have freedom of speech. But I think the more I've learned about just the way it is with at-will employees and the way people are treated in general as adjunct faculty members, I think it is a clear problem if we're moving towards the model of having more adjunct faculty and more at-will employees and eliminating tenure. And I was always on the side of the idea of eliminating tenure because I thought just kind of encourages laziness in a way. And I'm sorry to say that to people who might be on the other side, but I do feel like as time has gone on, my opinions on that have changed a little bit.
It's really, to me, the issue, that's one of the primary issues in this issue of tenure. And we don't have it here, we'll never have it here. But at a university where there is a real possibility of tenure is required because you have people that have gone through the system, they've spent 30 years of their life, plus or minus maybe 40 years to become a tenured person. They're not going, there are very few exceptions of people that, and I've seen a few examples, not here, but in a tenured environment, but not many. Everyone keeps producing because that's what they've done for 30 or 40 years. But why we need tenure is exactly to your point, and that is we need to be able to have divergent ideas. The first group that gets punished without freedom of speech are those that produce ideas outside the norm. And those are also frequently the ideas that produce results.
Right. Which is some of the problem when I think about that. If academia tends to skew liberal, then perhaps those with conservative ideas may need to pass as liberal for a long time in the system in order to get to receive tenure, then to have their conservative ideas come out, that's some of the conflict of it in a way, is that you still have to pass through a system in order to get tenure.
Kristen, remember,
Once you're
there's
there.
more involved in earning tenure than
Right.
freedom of speech, a lot more, right?
What's the term chilling, and what is the term that puts a damper on free speech? Chilling and what? You had a phrase for it?
Well, the chilling of,
Yeah,
the chilling effect.
Well, the chilling effect is that the state in the business model now records big data, like everybody else. And big data says that you lose 22% of your students every semester, you lose 38, you lose 12. And There's only one reason to collect that data. There's going to be a 10% rule someday. And that's the corporate model, that's what accountants are paid for.
Don't you think the idea that we're losing freedom of speech is what actually keeps freedom of speech alive? Because if we're always aware and there's that kind of thought out there that, oh, we're losing this right or this right, keeps people, keeps the conversation up about fighting for freedom of speech
And the free speech.
the perception that freedom of speech has diminished is somewhat of an illusion too, because I wouldn't want to have lived in the McCarthy era. It's a time when you couldn't say much. Maybe in the academic setting somewhat, because it's always, the academic setting's always been a place to express ideas, and that corporate model's not necessarily a good thing. But overall, I think probably if you do a comparison of 20 years ago, 40 years ago, you can probably say a lot more now than you could then without being punished for it.
Well, I think that's a very astute observation especially regarding McCarthy.
There's more to say.
Also, but some of that, I think, needs to be attributable just to simply how society has changed, and not so much about the rules, because this is not a constant. It's not a constant. And when we have new technology and we have new social norms, because every time that a group comes along and as they age, they go through the system, and then we have a new cohort that comes through, and they have different views, and I mean, we could all each pull out 10 different examples of that from what happened when we were children and what we could never expect to happen, and now it happens as an everyday occurrence. And just in that sense, it's a liberalization.
Kind of flows, like you said, in cycles or like a pendulum. You know, we had the 60s where expression was everywhere. But technology is the scary thing. That's a change that's coming with the cameras. And although the internet does allow more expression, because it's hard to find someone expressing themselves.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? Because we have many more possibilities, but we also have to be very careful to make certain that we maintain our rights along with the responsibilities. And it's a challenge. I agree. I think that's right.
Go ahead.
We had almost the same conversation with education and technology. You know, how has technology affected education? And some thought in a negative way, others in a positive way. There's different ways you can look at it. There's a trade-off, like you said. So again, with freedom of speech, how is technology, privacy, how's it affecting that? So.
I was going to thank Tony.
Thank you.